History is full of political paradoxes, but few are as bitter as this. Sometimes, the very act of assassinating a dictator to save a democracy is the exact trigger that guarantees its total destruction. By the year 44 BCE, Rome was technically still a republic, but the reality on the ground looked entirely different. Julius Caesar had returned from war as the undisputed most powerful man in the world. He controlled the military, dictated the laws, and was increasingly worshipped almost as a living god. This concentration of power bred deep resentment, splitting his opposition into two distinct camps. On one side, you had men like Cassius, driven by a deep personal envy of Caesar's divine status. On the other side, you had idealists like Brutus. Brutus didn't hate Caesar the man, but he was terrified that Caesar would inevitably crown himself king and formally dismantle the republic. Combine absolute supremacy with severe political anxiety, and you create a classic power vacuum scenario. When all the authority of an entire empire is concentrated in one single mortal body, taking that person's life suddenly looks like a highly efficient solution to a systemic problem. To succeed, a coup demands public legitimacy. Cassius had a ruthless motive, but he lacked the honorable reputation necessary to sell an assassination to the Roman people. To make the murder stick, he needed Brutus. To recruit his vital ally, Cassius resorted to psychological manipulation. He planted forged letters across Rome, complete with fake seals, making it appear as though everyday citizens were begging Brutus to step up and save them from Caesar's growing tyranny. The manipulation worked. Brutus convinced himself that they had to strike preemptively. In his mind, they needed to kill Caesar in the shell, stopping the dictator before he could officially wear a crown and abolish the Senate. By joining the conspiracy, Brutus provided a necessary ideological shield. His involvement rebranded a bitter political hit as an act of noble patriotism. The assassination itself relied entirely on Caesar's own hubris. On the morning of the Ides of March, he was bombarded with warnings. A soothsayer warned of the day. Violent storms battered the city. His wife Calpurnia woke from nightmares. But refusing to appear weak in public, Caesar went to work anyway. The conspirators executed their plot with military precision. Meeting him here, at the Senate complex near the Theater of Pompey, they crowded around Caesar under the guise of presenting a petition. They physically isolated him from his allies and struck. Caesar fought back violently against the ambush, until he saw his trusted friend Brutus stepping forward with a drawn blade. Seeing the depth of the betrayal, Caesar pulled his toga over his face and yielded to the fatal blows. In the immediate aftermath, the assassins engaged in a grisly ritual. They knelt down and bathed their hands and swords in Caesar's pooling blood, proudly marching out to show the public that Rome had been liberated. As a tactical military operation, the assassination was flawless. But as a strategy, it relied on a deeply naive political assumption: the belief that simply eliminating the autocratic figurehead would automatically snap the republic back to its former glory. The moment Caesar fell, the conspirators faced an immediate secondary crisis. They now had to figure out what to do with Mark Antony, Caesar's fiercely loyal, highly capable right-hand man. A bitter argument broke out over this single detail. Cassius demanded cold realpolitik, arguing they needed to execute Antony to eliminate the obvious threat. Brutus, leaning entirely on his idealism, refused. He argued that killing a second man would make them look like butchers, rather than healers. Brutus won the argument, but he followed it up with an even deadlier political error. He not only allowed Mark Antony to walk away with his life, he gave the loyalists a public platform to speak to the masses at Caesar's funeral. Sparing the loyalists of an overthrown regime is arguably the deadliest trap in the anatomy of a coup. Brutus was so blinded by his own idealistic self-image that he completely misunderstood how power is actually retained once blood is spilled. When the time came for the funeral, Brutus spoke to the crowd first. He appealed strictly to logic, outlining a cold, rational argument that the murder was a necessary evil for the survival of the Roman state. The public actually seemed to accept it. Then Mark Antony took the stage. He bypassed logic entirely, using heavy sarcasm, repeatedly calling Brutus an honorable man, and pointing directly to Caesar's mangled, bloody corpse. Antony whipped the crowd into a state of sheer emotional frenzy. This chart shows how Antony tipped the scales. He read Caesar's private will. While Brutus offered the abstract concept of liberty, Caesar's will provided tangible wealth, a sum of money paid to every citizen, and vast acreage turned into public parks. The physical fallout was immediate. Enraged that their generous leader had been slaughtered, the mob violently turned on the assassins. Brutus and Cassius were chased out of the city, forced to flee for their lives. In the span of a single speech, Antony successfully launched a massive counter-coup without initially deploying a single soldier. It proved that logical idealism rarely survives a direct collision with weaponized populism. This political collapse triggered a brutal, sprawling civil war. The exiled conspirators raised armies, but they were met by an opportunistic new alliance. Mark Antony, joined by Caesar's fiercely ambitious legal heir, Octavius. The final military confrontation took place on the plains of Philippi. Plagued by poor communication, strategic blunders, and completely erroneous reports of battlefield losses, the conspirators' forces were utterly overwhelmed by the loyalist armies. The resolution was incredibly grim. Rather than face capture, both Cassius and Brutus died by suicide. Standing over Brutus's body, even Antony had to admit that of all the assassins, Brutus was the only one driven by a genuine concern for the public good, rather than personal envy. The conspirators successfully executed their plot to remove a tyrant, but because they entirely failed to understand the political climate of the people they were supposedly saving, they created the exact chaotic conditions required for Octavius to tear down the Republic and crown himself Rome's very first emperor.